December 18th, 1944. Stavelot, Belgium. The morning fog clung to the cobblestone streets like wet wool, muffling the distant thunder of German artillery that had been pounding the Ardennes for 2 days straight. Private First Class Marcus Wheeler crouched behind a stack of jerry cans in what used to be a fuel depot on the edge of town, his M1 Garand clutched tight against his chest. Each breath came out as white vapor in the freezing air. Around him, thousands upon thousands of gallons of gasoline sat in drums, in cans, in whatever containers the quartermaster corps had managed to scrounge together over the past months of Allied advance across France. Wheeler was 22 years old, from Detroit, a former assembly line worker who'd been drafted in 1943. He'd seen combat in Normandy, survived the hedgerows, and thought he'd seen the worst of what this war had to offer. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, this impossible decision that now rested on his shoulders and those of the dozen other soldiers scattered around the depot. 2 days ago, on December 16th, over 200,000 German troops had smashed through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest. It was supposed to be a quiet sector, a place where green divisions got their feet wet and exhausted, veterans caught their breath. The Germans weren't supposed to attack here. The terrain was all wrong for tanks, dense forest and narrow roads winding through steep hills. Every military expert said it was impossible. The Germans didn't care what the experts said. They came anyway. Wheeler had heard the stories filtering back from the front lines, stories that seemed impossible until you saw the look in the eyes of the men telling them. Entire American units overrun in the first hours. Thousands of soldiers captured. The 106th Infantry Division, nearly 7,000 men, simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. German Tiger tanks and Panthers rolling through villages that hadn't seen combat since 1940, when the Wehrmacht had used these same roads to conquer France in 6 weeks. The plan was audacious, almost insane in its ambition. The Germans intended to drive all the way to Antwerp, splitting the British and American armies in two, cutting off supply lines, and forcing the Western Allies to negotiate a peace treaty. Hitler himself had planned it, overruling his generals who said it was impossible. Germany was on its last legs. Everyone knew it. The Russians were grinding toward Berlin from the east. American and British bombers were turning German cities into rubble. But Hitler believed one last desperate throw of the dice could change everything. And for 2 days, it had looked like he might be right. The spearhead of the German attack was Kampfgruppe Peiper, a battle group led by SS Colonel Joachim Peiper. His force consisted of tanks, half-tracks, and the best soldiers Germany still had available. They'd punch through American lines like a fist through wet paper, leaving a trail of burning vehicles and dead soldiers in their wake. At a crossroads near Malmedy, Peiper's men had massacred over 80 American prisoners of war, shooting them down in a field as they stood with their hands raised. Word of the massacre had spread through the American lines like wildfire, hardening resolve even as it spread fear. Peiper's tanks were now just 6 miles from where Wheeler crouched among the fuel drums. 6 miles, and between them and Stavelot stood only a handful of engineer companies and whatever scratch forces the First Army could scrape together. The 30th Infantry Division was moving up, but they wouldn't arrive in time. The ITC 2nd and 101st Airborne were being rushed to the Ardennes from their rest areas in France. But even America's elite paratroopers couldn't march faster than German tanks could drive. Lieutenant James Morton appeared through the fog, his face gray with exhaustion and something else. Fear, maybe, or the sick realization of what they were about to do. Morton was a logistics officer, 28 years old, from Pennsylvania. He'd spent the entire war managing supply depots, ensuring that boots and bullets and fuel reached the front lines. He'd never expected to be this close to combat. "Orders from 1st Army," Morton said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Peiper's less than an hour out. If we can't hold him, we burn it. All of it." Wheeler looked around at the fuel depot. 3 million gallons of gasoline, maybe more. Enough to fuel Patton's entire 3rd Army for a week. Enough to power the Allied advance all the way to the Rhine. The stuff was liquid gold, more valuable than ammunition, more precious than food. The whole Allied offensive had ground to a halt in November because they'd run out of fuel. The Red Ball Express, those legendary truck convoys driven mostly by African-American soldiers, had worn themselves out trying to keep the advancing armies supplied, burning 5 gallons of gas for every gallon they delivered to the front. And now they were going to set it all on fire. "Sir," Wheeler said, "are we sure? I mean, is there any chance we can evacuate it?" Morton shook his head. "Look around, Private. You see any trucks? Any way to move millions of gallons before Peiper's Panzers roll down that street?" He gestured toward the road leading east. "German intelligence knows this depot is here. They've known for weeks. Hell, it's probably the primary objective for Peiper's entire attack." Wheeler understood then. The Germans hadn't just attacked the Ardennes because the defenses were weak. They'd attacked because behind those weak defenses sat the fuel and ammunition dumps that sustained the Allied armies. The irony was bitter. Germany was so desperately short of fuel that its entire offensive depended on capturing Allied supplies. The Panzers that were now racing through Belgium had started with only enough fuel for 6 days of combat operations. Hitler's plan explicitly counted on seizing American fuel depots to keep the advance going. Without captured fuel, the German offensive was doomed before it started. The math was simple and brutal. The Wehrmacht had assembled enough gasoline for their assault force to cover maybe 1/3 of the distance to Antwerp. They needed to capture Allied fuel dumps along the way, or the offensive would sputter out somewhere in the Belgian countryside. Every gallon that American soldiers burned or evacuated was a gallon the Germans couldn't use to push toward the Meuse River, toward Antwerp, toward splitting the Allied armies. "The Belgians are helping," Morton continued. "Civilians, can you believe it? They're grabbing cans, loading them on carts, carrying them into the countryside, anything they can save from the Germans. But there's too much, and we're out of time." Through the fog, Wheeler heard the distinctive rumble of tank engines, heavy engines, German engines, the sound that American infantry had learned to fear across North Africa, through Italy, in the Norman hedgerows, the sound of Tigers and Panthers, tanks that could shrug off hits from American Shermans and kill them at ranges where the Shermans couldn't even fight back. "All right," Morton said, his voice steadier now. "Sergeant Williams has the demo charges. We set them on a 5-minute delay. That gives us time to fall back to the town center and link up with the engineers holding the bridge. When Peiper gets here, he finds nothing but empty drums and ashes. Wheeler and the other soldiers moved through the depot like men in a nightmare. They'd been trained to protect supplies, to guard them, to account for every gallon and every round. Now they were setting explosive charges under drums, filled with the most valuable commodity in the European theater. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Sergeant First Class Thomas Williams, a combat engineer from Virginia, supervised the placement of the charges. Williams had been blowing bridges and laying mines since D-Day. He'd become an expert in creative destruction, finding ways to deny the enemy everything they might use. His hands were steady as he rigged the detonators, but his face was grim. "You know what kills me?" Williams said to no one in particular. "We spent 6 months getting this fuel to the front. Drove it from Normandy, convoy after convoy, boys getting killed by Luftwaffe strafing runs, trucks breaking down, winter weather making every mile a nightmare. And now we're gonna light it up like a bonfire. Better us than them," another soldier replied. It was Corporal Johnson, one of the Red Ball Express drivers. Johnson was African-American from Chicago, one of thousands of black soldiers who'd kept the Allied armies moving despite being relegated to support roles by a segregated military. He'd driven through storms and German fire to deliver fuel to the front lines, and now he was watching it all prepare to go up in flames. "Damn right," Johnson said, checking the charges one more time. "You think I drove 500 miles from Normandy so the Nazis could gas up their tanks, let them walk back to Germany?" The charges were set. Morton checked his watch. 8:47 hours. Intelligence reports said Peiper had been in Bulge that morning, maybe 20 miles east, where his tanks had captured a small American fuel dump and topped off their tanks. That temporary reprieve had bought him a few more hours of operational range. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough for what Hitler wanted him to accomplish. "Fall back," Morton ordered. "Everyone to the bridge. Move, move." Wheeler grabbed his rifle and ran, his boots slipping on the icy cobblestones. Behind him, the jerry cans stood in neat rows, filled with the fuel that was supposed to carry the Allies into Germany. In 5 minutes, it would all be gone. They'd barely reached the bridge when the world exploded. The blast wave hit Wheeler like a physical force, knocking him forward into the frozen street. Heat washed over him, intense, even at 200 yards. He turned and saw a pillar of flame rising into the gray December sky, black smoke boiling upward, the roar of burning gasoline drowning out everything else. 3 million gallons of fuel going up all at once. The heat was so intense it melted snow for a quarter mile in every direction. Windows shattered in nearby buildings. The ground itself seemed to shake, and somewhere out in the fog, Peiper's Panzers were running on fumes. The destruction of the Stavelot fuel depot was just one part of a larger pattern unfolding across the Ardennes. At Spa, where First Army Headquarters was located, another massive fuel dump was being evacuated under fire. At Malmedy, American soldiers were torching supplies rather than let them fall into German hands. All across the Bulge that the German offensive was creating in the Allied lines, American quartermaster units were engaged in a desperate race to move or destroy supplies before the Germans could capture them. The German plan had been meticulously laid out. Intelligence officers had identified every major Allied supply dump in the rear areas: fuel depots, ammunition points, supply dumps. The routes were mapped. The objectives were clear. Kampfgruppe Peiper and other armored spearheads would race west, bypassing strong points, avoiding fights where possible, living off captured supplies like raiders behind enemy lines. It was the same tactic that had worked brilliantly in 1940, when German tanks had raced across France, refueling from French depots, outpacing the slower-moving infantry divisions. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, movement and speed, overwhelming static defenses. But this wasn't 1940. The American army wasn't the French army. American logistics officers had learned from 4 years of global war. When the German attack began, they didn't freeze. They didn't panic. They acted. Lieutenant Colonel John Douglas commanded the G4 section, the logistics branch of 1st Army Headquarters at Spa. When reports started flooding in on December 16th about a major German attack, Douglas immediately understood the implications. The Germans weren't just trying to break through the lines. They were trying to capture the supplies that sustained the Allied armies. Douglas ordered the evacuation of every depot within 30 miles of the front. He commandeered every truck he could find, stripped rear area units of their vehicles, and sent them racing toward the supply dumps. The orders were simple. If you can move it, move it. If you can't move it, destroy it. Don't leave the Germans anything they can use. The truck drivers of the Red Ball Express, already exhausted from months of round-the-clock operations, climbed back into their vehicles and headed toward the sound of the guns. Black soldiers who'd been denied combat roles by segregation policies now found themselves driving through German-held territory, racing against time to evacuate fuel before the Panzers arrived. Many of them never received proper recognition for what they did in those desperate December days, but their actions saved the Allied position. At the fuel depot near Malmedy, trucks arrived just hours before German tanks. Drivers loaded as much fuel as they could carry and headed west, making trip after trip, sometimes passing German patrols in the fog. What they couldn't evacuate, they burned. By the time Peiper's lead elements reached Malmedy, they found smoldering ruins and empty drums. The same story repeated itself across the Ardennes. At Boutgenbach, a truck head was evacuated minutes before German troops arrived. At an ammunition supply point near Vimes, engineers set charges and blew thousands of rounds skyward rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Every denial, every evacuation, every act of destruction carved away at the German offensive's viability. Peiper's Kampfgruppe felt the impact almost immediately. By December 18th, less than 48 hours into the offensive, his tanks were running low on fuel. He'd captured some supplies at Bulge, but it wasn't enough. The massive depots he'd been counting on, the ones German intelligence had identified and marked on his maps, were either empty or burning when his scouts reached them. At Stavelot, Peiper's tanks finally arrived in the afternoon of December 18th. They crossed the bridge into town and found the smoking ruins of the fuel depot. 3 million gallons of gasoline converted into a column of black smoke, visible for 20 miles. The heat was still intense enough that German soldiers couldn't approach the site. The jerry cans had melted into twisted metal sculptures. The ground itself had been scorched black. Peiper stood in the town square looking at the ruins and understood what had happened. The Americans had beaten him to the punch. They'd denied him the fuel he needed to continue the advance. His tanks had maybe enough fuel for another 20, maybe 30 miles of combat operations. After that, they'd be iron sculptures, too heavy to tow, too precious to abandon, too thirsty to move. He sent urgent messages back to ISS Panzer Corps headquarters. Send fuel. Send it now. Without it, the offensive stops here. But getting fuel forward to Peiper proved nearly impossible. The narrow roads of the Ardennes were clogged with German vehicles. Tanks mixed with half-tracks, mixed with horse-drawn wagons, because the Wehrmacht in 1944 was still partly dependent on horses for transport. Traffic jams stretched for miles. German military police tried to untangle the mess, but the terrain worked against them. One disabled vehicle could block an entire route. One wrong turn could send a column miles out of its way, and behind the German lines, Allied aircraft were beginning to appear. The fog and clouds that had grounded Allied planes for the first few days of the offensive were clearing. On December 23rd, the weather broke, and suddenly the sky belonged to the Americans and British. P-47 Thunderbolts and RAF Typhoons swarmed over the Ardennes, shooting up anything that moved on the roads. German fuel convoys, already struggling to reach the forward units, became priority targets. A fuel truck, after all, makes a spectacular explosion when hit by a rocket or cannon fire. German soldiers learned to scatter when they heard aircraft engines overhead. But the trucks, the precious tankers carrying the gasoline that Peiper and other spearhead commanders desperately needed, those couldn't scatter. They could only burn. By December 24th, Christmas Eve, Peiper's Kampfgruppe had advanced to within 4 miles of the Meuse River, 4 miles from the first major objective. From there, it was less than 50 miles to Antwerp. The plan was still alive, barely, hanging by a thread. And then the fuel ran out. Peiper later said, in interrogations after the war, that the moment he realized the offensive had failed wasn't when American reinforcements arrived, wasn't when Allied aircraft filled the skies, wasn't even when his troops ran out of ammunition. It was when his tanks ran out of gas. Everything else you could work around. You could fight without air cover. You could improvise ammunition. You could outmaneuver superior forces if you were clever and your troops were good. But you couldn't drive tanks without fuel. The laws of physics didn't care how skilled your tankers were or how determined your infantry. An empty fuel tank meant an immobile tank, and an immobile tank in enemy territory was just an expensive piece of metal waiting to be destroyed or captured. On Christmas Eve, Peiper gave the order to abandon the vehicles and retreat on foot. His men disabled their tanks and half-tracks, smashing instruments, destroying radios, anything that might be useful to the Americans. Then they walked back toward German lines through the snow, leaving behind the machines that were supposed to carry them to victory. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, advancing on Peiper's flank, ran out of fuel just short of Dinant. 3 miles from the Meuse River, they'd gotten farther than any other German unit in the offensive, close enough to see the river, close enough to almost touch the bridges that would have carried them west toward Antwerp. But you can't cross a river in a tank that won't start. British forces on the western side of the Meuse watched German tanks coast to a stop on the eastern bank, their engines falling silent, not from battle damage, but from empty fuel tanks. It was a strange kind of victory, won not by superior firepower, but by superior logistics. The British didn't have to destroy the German tanks. The tanks destroyed themselves simply by running out of gas. All across the Ardennes, the same story repeated. German spearheads that had advanced 50, 60, even 70 miles into Allied territory ground to a halt, not because American infantry stopped them, but because their fuel gauges hit empty. Tank crews sat in their vehicles, scanning the roads behind them for the fuel convoys that never came. Infantry divisions that were supposed to follow the armor and consolidate gains never arrived because they couldn't move faster than horses could pull supply wagons. The German offensive that Hitler had promised would change the course of the war died not with a bang, but with a sputter, the sound of tank engines coughing on empty fuel lines, gears grinding to a halt, silence descending over steel machines that had carried Wehrmacht hopes of reversing their fortunes. By January 1945, American and British forces had eliminated the Bulge, pushing German forces back to their start lines. The cost had been staggering. Nearly 20,000 American soldiers killed, another 50,000 wounded or captured. British casualties added another 1,400. The 106th Infantry Division effectively ceased to exist as a combat unit. Entire companies and battalions had been overrun in the first days of fighting. But German losses were worse, not just in numbers, but in irreplaceability. Over 100,000 German casualties, tanks destroyed or abandoned, aircraft shot down in Operation Baseplate, a desperate attempt to regain air superiority that cost the Luftwaffe over 200 pilots it couldn't replace. And most critically, fuel consumed that Germany no longer had the means to produce or acquire. The Romanian oil fields, Germany's primary source of petroleum, had fallen to the Soviets in August 1944. Synthetic fuel plants were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. The fuel that Hitler had gambled on the Ardennes Offensive was fuel Germany didn't have for defending against the Soviet advance in the east or for protecting German cities from the around-the-clock bomber offensive. Wheeler, the private from Detroit who'd helped set charges at the Stavelot fuel depot, survived the Battle of the Bulge. He fought through the final months of the war, crossed the Rhine in March 1945, and was in Germany when Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. After the war, he returned to Detroit and worked in an automotive plant, building the cars that had replaced the tanks. He didn't talk much about his war experiences, but sometimes on cold December evenings, he'd think about that morning in Stavelot. The fog, the sound of approaching tanks, the impossible decision to destroy supplies his fellow soldiers had risked their lives to deliver, the pillar of flame rising into the winter sky. Lieutenant Morton, the logistics officer, received a commendation for his actions during the battle. The official citation mentioned his quick thinking and decisive action in denying critical supplies to enemy forces. It didn't mention the sick feeling of watching months of logistical effort go up in flames, or the knowledge that every gallon burned was a gallon that American tanks wouldn't have for future operations. But Morton understood, as did the other logistics officers who'd made similar decisions across the Ardennes, that the destruction of those fuel depots had been necessary. The German offensive wasn't stopped by heroic last stands or brilliant tactical maneuvers, though there were plenty of both. It was stopped by the unglamorous work of supply officers and truck drivers and engineers who understood that sometimes the most important contribution you can make is denying the enemy the resources they need. Historians examining the Battle of the Bulge have identified multiple factors in the German defeat: the tenacious defense of road junctions at Bastogne and Saint-Vith, the rapid response of Patton's Third Army, which wheeled north and relieved Bastogne in a feat of logistics and command that remains impressive, the clearing weather that allowed Allied aircraft to devastate German columns, the arrival of American reinforcements. But underlying all of those factors was the fuel crisis. Every German tactical decision after December 18th was constrained by the knowledge that fuel was running out. Commanders had to choose which units to supply and which to leave stranded. Advances had to be called off not because of enemy resistance, but because tanks couldn't move. Retreats had to be conducted on foot because there wasn't enough fuel to withdraw mechanized units. The American soldiers who burned those fuel depots didn't know, in the moment, that they were delivering a killing blow to Hitler's last gamble. They were just following orders, doing their jobs, making hard decisions in impossible circumstances, but their actions, multiplied across dozens of supply dumps throughout the Ardennes, created a logistical catastrophe that the Germans couldn't overcome. Winston Churchill, addressing the House of Commons after the battle, called it undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war. He was right, but not perhaps for the reasons he imagined. It was great not just for the courage of the soldiers who fought and died in the frozen forests, but for the unglamorous work of the supply troops who ensured that German tanks ran out of gas before they reached their objectives. The Battle of the Bulge proved what military theorists had suspected, but hadn't fully grasped. Modern mechanized warfare isn't won primarily on the battlefield. It's won in the supply depots, the fuel dumps, the logistics networks that keep armies moving. The most advanced tanks in the world are useless without fuel. The best trained soldiers can't advance without supplies. The most brilliant strategy fails if the logistics can't support it. Germany learned this lesson the hard way. Twice. In Russia, the Wehrmacht had advanced to the gates of Moscow in 1941, before being stopped partly by Soviet resistance, but also by supply lines stretched beyond the breaking point. In the Ardennes in 1944, they tried the same strategy on a smaller scale, and failed for the same reasons. You can't conquer territory faster than you can supply your forces. And you can't supply your forces if the enemy destroys or evacuates the supplies you planned to capture. For the soldiers who survived the Bulge, both American and German, the memory of that winter would stay with them forever. The cold that froze fingers and toes, that turned tanks into ice-covered tombs when crew members died inside them. The hunger as supply lines broke down on both sides. The fear of artillery that could arrive without warning, turning a peaceful forest clearing into an abattoir in seconds. The sick knowledge that at any moment a German infiltrator might appear wearing an American uniform, making every checkpoint a moment of suspicion and paranoia. But perhaps more than any of those memories, what stuck with the veterans was the sound of silence. The moment when German tank engines stopped, when the artillery fell quiet, when the fear that had gripped the Ardennes for weeks finally began to ease. The sound of an army running out of fuel, running out of ammunition, running out of the resources needed to sustain modern warfare. The photographs from late December 1944 and January 1945 show abandoned German tanks lining the roads of Belgium, their hulls intact, their guns still functional, but their fuel tanks empty. German soldiers trudging back toward their own lines on foot, leaving behind the vehicles that had carried them so far into Allied territory. American soldiers examining captured equipment, marveling at the quality of German engineering, puzzling over why these advanced machines had simply stopped. The answer was simple. They stopped because they ran out of gas. Because American supply officers had made hard decisions. Because truck drivers had risked their lives evacuating fuel dumps. Because engineers had set charges and destroyed supplies rather than let them be captured. Because in total war, every action matters, and sometimes the most important action is denying your enemy the resources they need. The Battle of the Bulge was the last time the German military launched a major offensive in the West. After January 1945, it was all retreat, all desperate defense, all fighting for time that everyone knew was running out. The fuel that Hitler had gambled on the Ardennes was fuel Germany would desperately need in the coming months, as Soviet and American armies closed in from east and west. By May 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, its armed forces were shadows of what they had once been, not just because of casualties, not just because of lost territory, but because the industrial base that sustained them had collapsed. You can't fight a modern war without fuel, without steel, without the industrial capacity to produce weapons and ammunition. The Ardennes Offensive was supposed to buy Germany time, to split the Allies, to force a negotiated peace that would let Hitler concentrate on fighting the Soviets. Instead, it accelerated Germany's defeat by consuming resources Germany couldn't replace. Every tank abandoned in Belgium was a tank that couldn't defend Berlin. Every gallon of fuel burned in the Ardennes was a gallon that wasn't available for the desperate final defense. And it all came down to fuel, to the unglamorous, critical, absolutely essential logistics that keep armies moving, to the soldiers like Wheeler and Morton and Johnson, who did their jobs even when those jobs meant destroying the very supplies they'd worked so hard to deliver. The next time you hear about the Battle of the Bulge, remember this. The German offensive didn't fail because of any single factor. It failed because American soldiers, often acting on their own initiative, denied the Germans the fuel they needed to continue. It failed because the Allied logistical system, though strained almost to breaking, held together just long enough. It failed because in modern warfare, logistics matters more than courage, though both are necessary. The Germans learned why their advance suddenly slowed, why their tanks stopped, why their great offensive withered and died in the Belgian countryside. They learned that you can't conquer Europe on empty fuel tanks, no matter how advanced your weapons or how skilled your soldiers. That's a lesson we should remember. In any conflict, in any endeavor, success isn't just about the quality of your equipment or the skill of your personnel. It's about the systems that support them, the supplies that sustain them, the logistics that enable them to do their jobs. Break those systems, deny those supplies, disrupt those logistics, and even the most formidable force grinds to a halt. That's why the enemy suddenly slowed down in December 1944, not because they lost the will to fight, not because American resistance was insurmountable, but 'cause they ran out of gas, and all the courage and skill in the world can't make a tank move without fuel. If this story of logistics, sacrifice, and the unglamorous reality of modern warfare moved you, we'd love to hear from you. Hit that subscribe button and join our community dedicated to preserving the real stories of World War II, the ones that textbooks often overlook. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, what part of this story surprised you most, and what stories from the war you'd like us to cover next. Were you from the United States? From Belgium, where these events took place? From Germany, whose history is forever marked by these decisions? Wherever you're listening, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Every view, every like, every comment tells us that these stories matter, that the sacrifices of soldiers like Marcus Wheeler and the decisions of officers like James Morton deserve to be remembered. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that war isn't just about battles and tactics. It's about fuel and food and all the unglamorous details that determine who wins and who loses. Thank you for watching, thank you for remembering, and we'll see you in the next one.